Oh, welcome, welcome, my friends. Glad you can join me here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment on a Sunday afternoon. This weather sure is getting better. I'm happy about it, and so are you. We all love each other. Glad you're joining me. Now is the time to take that moment and tweet this out and make this a bigger conversation because we have plenty to talk about today. Lovely, lovely YouTube Live. Shout out to Jacob James, the first message that I see coming across my screen. Glad you're joining us, Jacob. Shout out to Lisa. Glad you're joining us. Shout out to Ronnie Miller. Glad you're joining us as well. Drinking some of the beverage that will not be named. Shout out to Viriathus. Shout out to JT24. Hi, Caleb in chat. Glad you're all here. Tweet this out. Make this a bigger chat. Shout out to Kareem. And no, it is not water, Kareem. This beverage that I will not name because I'm not getting any product placement money is definitely not water. There's a lot of water in it, right? From what I understand, it's like 90% water or something. But shout out to Kyle Preston. Shout out to Joshua. Glad you're all joining me here. We're going to have a great time. A lot of things to discuss this afternoon. A lot of important issues. I have been calling these lives Critical Moment in America. That's been the subtitle. But there you go. There you go. Water is important. It is important to drink water. I will say that. Water is much more healthy for you than diet beverage. But there you go. Glad you're joining us. So, I don't know if folks have seen it. If you're one of the people that follow the pro-Venezuelan media, or social media, I should say, people that tweet out in defense and refute some of the lies against Maduro and the PSUV government, the PSUV government in Venezuela, the United Socialist Party, then you're probably familiar with this clip. Recently on Fox News, there was a young woman of Venezuelan heritage, and she was speaking on Fox News, and she talked about why she immigrated to the United States. And she said, well, in the 1980s, Hugo Chavez and socialism was just so bad, my family had to flee from Venezuela. Well, here's the thing, folks. Hugo Chavez was not elected president of Venezuela until 1999. He did not announce the goal of building 21st century socialism in Venezuela until 2003. So this is completely ridiculous. So how is it that her family was fleeing from Venezuela's socialism before Hugo Chavez was even elected, before the Socialist Party was even created, before all of this? How was it in the 1980s that she was fleeing from socialism? And of course, was she challenged on it? Did anyone step in and go, no, no, of course not. Because whenever, and this is what I wanted to talk about, because this is a bigger conversation. And there have been times I've talked about this, but I want to talk about this in a more rational, cool-headed, analytical way. Because if you start talking about socialism in the United States, inevitably, because this is the United States, you'll get somebody who will say to you, well, have you ever talked to anyone who actually lived under that, Caleb, or Joe Bob, or whatever your name is, Susie, Steve, Ethel? Have you ever talked to anyone who actually lived under communism or a communist party? I met blank. I met this person who lived up the street from me. I met this person living in Miami whose family fled Fidel Castro. I met this person who immigrated here from Eastern Europe during the 1990s, and they told me that socialism in whatever country was utter hell on earth. It was just an utter disaster. And therefore, I don't know how you could believe in it, because everyone I've ever met who lived under it, and me living here in the United States, they told me it was a nightmare. And here's the thing. In every formerly socialist country of Eastern Europe, be it Czechoslovakia, Romania, Russia, Belarus, well, Belarus is still a socialist government, but, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, every single one of those countries, they've taken polls, and people overwhelmingly say that life was better before the fall of socialism, right? And the number goes up and down. Romania, sometimes it's been lower, but more recently it's been higher. Soviet nostalgia in Russia is at an all-time high, according to some polls that have come out. In all of these countries, people say that life was better under socialism. And it's not just, the mainstream forces like, Reuters and, New York Times and mainstream sources that point this out. There's actually some of these right-wing foundations have even written articles about this and how it shows that anti-communist work is so important because the people in the former socialist countries have just forgotten how evil the socialism was. And if you go to the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, if you go to Russia, you ask people who votes for the Communist Party in the Russian elections, and they say elderly folks, retired people, the people who lived under it, right? And so what these people who have fled from their homeland, moved to the United States, and they say, it was horrible, I lived under it, it was horrible, are saying is out of step with what most of the people who lived under it think, in Eastern Europe in particular, right? They lived under it, and overwhelmingly, in poll after poll after poll, from very mainstream, very anti-communist sources, people say that life was better in terms of, they didn't have to fear about economics. So overwhelmingly, people say that life was better, but the people who come to the United States say the opposite. And there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, these are people that were able to get visas and move to the United States. Generally, in order to do that, you have to have some kind of relationship, right? That the U.S. government has to think that you're worth bringing here. And obviously, they're not going to bring people who are, hardcore communists and socialists to the United States. Second of all, you may be surprised by this, but there are actually people who are immigrants from formerly socialist countries or socialist countries who do think positively of the socialist leadership. There are Venezuelans in the United States who admire Hugo Chavez. For example, when I was in Queens, there was a guy, I used to, pay him like $5 when I would get off the train. Instead of having to take the bus, I would have, take like a taxi kind of thing. There was a taxi, it wasn't a taxi, kind of an off-the-record taxi driver from Ecuador who loved Rafael Correa, and he loved the socialist government of Ecuador. And that you do meet people in the United States who are Venezuelan or Bolivian or Ecuadorian who do admire the socialist governments. But they're careful about talking about it because that's grounds for deportation. One of the things when you're becoming a U.S. citizen, one of the things they ask is, are you a member of the Communist Party? Your citizenship can be blocked on the basis of it. And immigrants know that. And so if immigrants have pro-socialist or pro-communist viewpoints, they're not going to advertise that to the world because there's a real danger that it could cause them problems. In addition to that, and I'll throw this out there. I remember one time I was on a train with a friend of mine back when I used to sell communist newspapers. We were on a train. We're selling a copy of this communist newspaper on the train. There was a woman from Romania, and she says to me, I lived under communism, and it was horrible. And so I said to her, well, wouldn't you say that it's a lot worse now in Romania? And she paused for a moment, and she just paused. And she said, yeah, actually, it's far, far worse now. My family tells me things are far, far worse now, right? And that points to another fact, which is the United States has a very high standard of living, right? And the comparison isn't the United States versus the socialist country. It's the socialist country after socialism to when socialism existed. And yeah, and she paused for a moment because no one had ever said to her, is life better now? People had always just said to her, oh, isn't life better in the United States? And of course it is. We got, higher incomes here, higher living standard, and all of that, right? But yes, life in Romania, since the fall of the Soviet Union, since the fall of socialism, since the overthrow of Ceausescu, life has gotten far worse. You should see the austerity that they're dealing with there now. And polls in Romania, just like every other former socialist country, people say life is worse. And she'd never even thought to make that comparison. She thought the comparison between capitalism and communism was USA versus Romania under socialism when she was a child. And no one would argue, no one in their right mind would say that Romania under socialism in the 80s was better than the United States is today, right? But that's the comparison there. And that's, again, the way people frame the arguments. And again, the other thing is when these people come to the United States, right, they get rewarded. If they walk around the United States saying, hey, life in my socialist country was hell, Americans will gather around them and say, tell me more. I want to hear more of what you're saying. And if they say, well, actually, socialism wasn't so bad. In fact, people are going to get nervous, right? Because then they're defending the evil dictators and so you get rewarded for saying one thing. You get kind of looked at strangely for saying another thing. And so you hear one thing. So what you hear from people who fled from formerly socialist countries in the United States, that is not really, an accurate assessment of what went on. It is an assessment of what a group of people who fled to the United States have learned to say. And that's the reality of those conversations. And then that points to something that is even deeper. And this is something that is even deeper, okay? So, like, for example, and that doesn't say I'm not going to deny that these people just straight up lie or just straight up distort information, right? I mean, there's a joke, I mean, the Miami Cubans are notorious for just making things up. I mean, just making things up. Just saying crazy things, and Fidel Castro killed 100 bajillion gamillion people and ate their brains. I saw it with my own eyes. How dare you? And they play the I lived under it card. They play that card, right? And whatever they say, you're not allowed to disagree with. Fidel Castro, he ate 1 million gajillion people's brains. I watched it personally. What can you say to those people, right? And you talk to every one of them. They were all millionaires and billionaires in Cuba, but Cuba was a paradise. I mean, you talk to them. But beyond that, beyond the fact that, like, this woman who claims she fled socialism in Venezuela in the 1980s, beyond people saying outrageously untrue things, beyond the fact that the people in the United States get rewarded for talking a certain way, and they don't get rewarded if they talk another way, beyond the fact that in addition to that, you have a very select group of people, and that if they want to get a visa and all that, they better not be saying anything pro-communist. Beyond even that, we need to talk about a deeper political truth, which is that wars tend to have two sides on them. And what side you are on in a war generally is not determined by your ideology, right? I mean, and you don't even have to talk about wars, right? If you're watching this live, you're special, okay? I'm just going to be real, all right? I hate to beat around the bush, but if you're the kind of person that is watching this conversation, you think about politics in a deeper way, right? You're the kind of person that would go read the writings of Karl Marx. You're the kind of person that would go maybe read the writings of a fascist leader. You're the kind of person that would study politics and political theory and try to learn different ideologies and different perspectives. Most people are not like that. And you can see this in the United States, right? In certain states, people are Democrats. In other states, people are Republicans. Why? Most people, they become Democrats or they become Republicans because they live in a town where everyone's a Democrat or everyone's a Republican. Their family tend to be Democrats or tend to be Republicans. The people in their community tend to be Democrats or Republicans. Most people they know think a certain way. They hear this viewpoint around there. Most people in their area think in a certain way, and that's what they think. And that's kind of how it is. And most people generally don't think about politics in too much depth. They don't, right? If they're from a Republican area, their family are Republicans, people in their town are Republicans, they're going to be Republicans. If they're from a Democratic Party area like New York City, and their family are Democrats, and the people that they see at work are Democrats, and the people in their social life are Democrats, they're going to be a Democrat. And they're not going to give too much thought to it. And once, when election time rolls around, they're going to go and punch the ballot to vote for the Democrats. And they're not going to think too much about it, right? And politics is a battle of personalities, and the Democrats have a personality that's closer to their personality, or the Republicans have a personality that's closer to their personality. They don't think about these things with too much depth. That's how most of humanity lives. I'm not trying to put them down. I'm not trying to be an elitist here, but that's how most people think. They don't delve into this stuff deeply. So when there's a civil war in a country with communists on one side and anti-communists on another side, most people aren't sitting there and saying, well, the Chinese Civil War, right? Let's talk about the Chinese Civil War. For 25 years, there was armed civil war in China. At first, it was between the Chinese Communist Party and the nationalists. Later, it became an alliance between the Chinese Communist Party and the nationalists against the Japanese invaders. Then it went back to being, between the Chinese Communist Party and the nationalists, and that ultimately led to the creation of the People's Republic of China. Most people living in China, it was not a matter, they didn't, get a copy of Mao Zedong's writings and a copy of Chiang Kai-shek's writings and sit there and read them in great depth and ponder them. Should I support the nationalist KMT line of Mao or of Chiang Kai-shek, or should I support the communist and Marxist-Leninist line of Mao Zedong? Which should I do? And ponder these writings and most people did not do that. If they were in an area where Mao was strong and people supported Mao, they supported Mao. And if they were in an area where Chiang Kai-shek was strong and people supported Chiang Kai-shek, they supported Chiang Kai-shek. That was it. I mean, and that's how most people think about politics, no matter where you go, right? The U.S. Civil War, right? There were outliers. There were people in the South of the United States who were really opposed to slavery and didn't fight for the Confederacy. But most people, hey, if they were in the South, slavery was what was going on, and they were on the Southern side. If they were in the North, slavery's wrong, and they were on the northern side. For most people in wars, for most people in everyday politics, politics is not a deep decision. It's not something they think about in a deeply conscious way. They just kind of go along with what most people are doing. And war is hell. It is. Awful, awful things happen in wars, right? Let's just be real about that, right? So then that makes things even more complicated, right? If you were in an area in China that was supporting Chiang Kai-shek, and that area then got invaded by the communists, and a lot of your relatives ended up being killed or being executed, or your area was... You're going to come to the United States with that trauma, that history, and that's how it's going to be. That's going to be your reality. Meanwhile, if you were in an area that was supporting the communists, and the nationalist KMT committed atrocities against you, and the communists went in there and redistributed land and made your life better, that's going to be your reality. And you're going to see it that way. And that's just how these things work. And so you have to understand, and one thing I will say, is that it's not good to deny that bad things went on, right? And that's something that I see a lot of young communists do, and there's no need to do that, right? A lot of people were executed when Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba, right? A lot of people who'd been part of the Batista government, they were charged with committing atrocities under the Batista regime, and they were executed. Now, the communist perspective is going to be, well, they deserved it, right? They were under the old regime that was awful and murdering people, and they deserved it. And that's going to be how communists are going to see it. And that's how the majority of Cubans see it. The majority of Cubans at this time support Fidel Castro and think that those executions were more or less justified. But you got to think about it, right? If that was a member of your family, if that was, somebody that you knew who was getting executed after the revolution, your perspective on it is going to be that Fidel Castro is a monster. And that's the reality of politics. For most people, politics is not a matter of great, great depth, right? It's a matter of where you're at, who you're talking to, your community. That's how it is for most people. So these people who flee to the United States after their country has a socialist revolution are people that are going to see things based on a certain way of thinking. They don't speak for the entire experience of their country. They clearly don't. Right? And that needs to be understood, right? And that these Venezuelans who are in the United States, who hate Maduro, who tend to be almost as light-skinned as I am, who think that Hugo Chavez was a crazy communist, I gotta tell you, you know what I mean? I gotta tell you, they don't represent the people of Venezuela. However, they represent their experience, how they saw things. And that's why they're in the United States. So this whole gusano, and gusano is the term, it's like crawler or whatever, it's a derogatory term the Cubans use for those who flee to the United States. They do not represent the history of socialism in their country. They represent their own experience, their perspective, their neighborhood, their community, how they see things, right? And that if you can start to understand politics this way and realize that for most people, the way I think about politics, the way you think about politics if you're watching this live is not how most people relate to politics. You can understand why there are people here, in the United States screaming about anti-communism, but they don't represent the actual experience of most people in their country, right? And that needs to be understood, right? And, I gotta tell you, though, sometimes you talk to these people, and they're really dumb. Like, I will never forget, and I've probably told you all about it before, but I need to repeat this. The conversation I had in college with the Brazilian students who hated Lula da Silva. They just hated Lula da Silva. And I said to them, what do you think of Lula da Silva? These are Brazilian students at my college. I said, he's horrible. Just a communist, horrible leader. Oh, he's just awful, awful, awful. And I said, well, isn't he elected? And they said, yes, he's elected because we have this law in Brazil that everybody has to vote. Everybody has to vote. I said, what do you mean? They said, all these poor people who are illiterate and they don't, they have no business voting. They don't understand politics. They all get to vote. And so they vote for Lula da Silva. And I thought that was very odd. And I said, did you know that at one point Lula da Silva delivered boxes for a living? He was a package delivery man. I mean, this is awful. Brazil is a civilized nation. We speak Portuguese, not Spanish. We're not uncivilized like the rest of South America. Oh, how dare, Lula da Silva. I mean, the classism was just pretty blatant. But then the best question was then when I followed up with, I said, so why do all these poor people vote for Lula da Silva? And they said, yes. They said, because he just gives them all jobs. I said, what? They said, yeah, he just gives them all jobs. It's like bribery. They vote for him, he gives them jobs, and that's how it works. And the level of elitism you can hear from the right wing of South America is very, very extreme. And the level of racism is very extreme, too. It's not like U.S. racism, where it's like one drop makes you not white. It's more like a shadism. They want to be, the whiter you are, the better you are, the darker you are, the more they revile you. That's why Hugo Chavez was commonly called, the right-wing opposition in Venezuela would say really nasty, racist things about him. That's the reality. And if you understand these kind of politics, if you can see it that way, of course, but beyond even that, right? I think it needs to be said that people have different experiences. People see things differently, and the way. And let's also be real that, that in order to maintain socialism in an atmosphere of fighting with very, very vicious forces and an atmosphere of low economic development, in a case of civil war, that socialist countries tend to be very authoritarian, right? They don't have the luxury of having as much of an open society as we have in the West, because they don't have that level of material abundance. And that's the reality. So I'm seeing a lot of different messages here in the comments section. But what else is going on here? I've got plenty of things to talk about. A lot on our minds. Now, I wanted to mention that, I don't know if folks saw, but Donald Trump has refused to implement new sanctions against North Korea, against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. He's refused to implement the new sanctions. And Sarah Huckabee Sanders, representing the White House, basically gave the reason for that, coming out and saying that Trump doesn't feel that these new sanctions are necessary. He wants to continue working with Kim. And there seems to be a pretty big division. And I said this in my last live, and I'll say it now, and I've written articles pointing this out. There seems to be a pretty big division among the circles of power in the United States over the question of these North Korea talks. And Donald Trump seems to be really doubling down. He really wants to engage in these negotiations with North Korea. And it seems like, I would say probably the majority in the USA, among the rich and powerful, don't agree with him on this. They don't want to have nuclear negotiations with North Korea. They want to just continue to isolate and engage in a state of siege against North Korea. And the Heritage Foundation denounced Trump. Actually, they denounced him over this move. The various different forces within the right wing have denounced Trump because he's refusing to implement these new sanctions against North Korea. And I think, and I've written about this before, there is a difference. There is a division within the ruling class of the United States over how to deal with North Korea. And that division needs to be acknowledged. I wrote an article about this. I've actually already written a follow-up article on this, that you need to understand that there are some capitalists in the United States that think that a Deng Xiaoping moment in North Korea, a 1980s reform and opening up moment in North Korea, would be a great way to make a lot of money. They do. They think that if they could have that moment in North Korea, they could make a lot of money. But there is another section of American capital that is much more long-term thinking. And they think that doing that would be a big mistake. And back in September, the World Economic Forum published a very interesting article about Vietnam. Right? The World Economic Forum, Davos, they believe in neoliberalism. And they published this article about the economic miracle that has taken place in Vietnam in the last 10, 20 years, right? Vietnam has had a huge rise in GDP, huge rise in the standard of living. And if you read the article, they try to give all credit to reform and opening up and liberalization, but they can't even help but mention the fact that, yes, the Vietnamese government has done a huge amount to provide education for the population, and that obviously helps, makes them much more hireable. And on top of that, the Vietnamese government has spent a huge amount of money on infrastructure, right? They've done a huge amount to develop the infrastructure of Vietnam. And to top it all off, they have been really investing in tech and in technology, right? And just like China has been able to use capitalism, to use the free market capitalists around the world, bring them into their socialist country, and utilize the market sector in order to strengthen their overall state-run planned economy, just like that, Vietnam has done the same thing. And they have had what the World Economic Forum refers to as an economic miracle. And it's pretty clear that forces like George Soros, in particular, George Soros is probably the most outspoken of them, do not want that to happen in North Korea. They fear that if Kim Jong-un is able to have a Deng Xiaoping moment, and he's able to preside over the standard of living vastly increasing in North Korea, that he will get stronger and not weaker, and that Russia and China will be able to more solidify what they're doing with the One Belt, One Road initiative, with the Eurasian Economic Union, and that's what they fear, right? The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they fear this bloc, this new economy that's emerging centered around Russia and China in the world. They're afraid of it. And they fear that allowing a reform and opening up moment in North Korea will ultimately strengthen the Korean Workers' Party. Jim Rogers doesn't think that. Jim Rogers is on Fox News. He was in Singapore. I mean, he lives in Singapore. Jim Rogers, the billionaire investor, I think I've got his book here, right? And he's Austrian school. This guy's a Ron Paul guy. But he really believes that opening up North Korea, doing business with North Korea is a great way to make money. It'll, bring peace into the world, and I agree with that, too. It totally will, right? I mean, you're not going to go to war with a country if you're heavily invested in it. And Jim Rogers is very outspoken in saying he wants economic relations between the USA and North Korea. He wants to lift the sanctions. He wants North Korea and the rest of the world to start doing business with each other. George Soros, who is his long-standing rival, right? They were in business together back in the 70s. They don't get along very much. He's given diplomatic answers when asked about it, but it's pretty clear that the two men are not big pals. Soros is a Democrat. This guy is a Republican and a Libertarian. The two of them don't agree. And it's pretty clear that Jim Rogers, he wants, to do business with North Korea, whereas, and this is the thing, whereas a lot of the ruling class fears what the results and eventual fallout of that will be. And I must say, I get really annoyed, right? Whenever you point to the economic successes of China, someone just says, oh, that's because they're capitalists, right? And these are the same people. These are the same exact people. Shout out to Lady Ravenhair. I saw that you're watching. Friend of mine. Stay tuned. These are the exact same people that will say, oh, we can't have free healthcare in the United States, then we'll become communist. We can't have the government spend money on roads. That'll be communist. We can't give people free college. That's communist. But then 2 seconds later, they're like, well, China's capitalist. China has a government-controlled banking system. It has the biggest steel manufacturing apparatus in the world, and it's controlled by the government, right? The China steel manufacturing run by the government. They have a huge government-controlled corporation called Huawei that is the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. The level of state control and state activity in the Chinese economy is massive, right? And the same people that will insist, oh, if we have a slightly higher welfare state in the USA, then we'll be communist. We'll sit there and go, oh, China's capitalist. China has a market sector. It's very big. There are a lot of corporations in China, but even the private corporations in China are controlled by the state. They are not allowed to do whatever they want to do. The government comes in there and tells them what to do. China has 5-year economic plans. China has a ruling communist party with 90 million members. Government-controlled banks, government-controlled industries. They shut down corporations all the time. They have executed billionaires. It's one thing if you want to be Mr. Simon Pure and be like, well, no, China is not following the true line of... Fine, you do that, okay? I don't agree with you. You have the right to do that. But to sit there, these libertarian types, that sit there and say, socialism's failed everywhere. It's ever been tried. No socialist country's ever done anything good. And that's why we can't have free healthcare or free college, because if we do that, we're going to be poor like every other socialist country. Oh, my God. And then they're like, oh, China's capitalist. Do they have a hole in their head? I really don't get it, right? China with socialism, has gone from being one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the, at this point, the second largest economy on earth. Every day you've got a new millionaire being created, all kinds of billionaires. The standard of living has vastly increased with an economy that is heavily controlled by the state. Meanwhile, all over the developing world, you've got free market countries. Bangladesh, right? Haiti, right? Haiti, that's they've had free market policies there. NAFTA and the Clintons, they don't even make their own food anymore. They're just a captive of Wall Street monopolies, right? Honduras, they had their socialist leader toppled back in 2009, and now they've got free markets, neoliberalism. Guatemala, all these free market countries you can go to. Nigeria, the top oil producing country in Africa, now that Libya has been bombed and destroyed, right? Nigeria, where Shell Oil and Chevron and BP, where they have all the power. You can see the results of free market policies all over the developing world. All over the developing world. But China went from being a deeply poor country to being a superpower with socialism. Vietnam has had an economic miracle with socialism. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was the least developed country in Europe. It was miles behind Western Europe in terms of development. They ended up being the first country in outer space. They achieved huge amounts. They were producing more steel than anybody else. They had the world's largest hydroelectrical power plants. They electrified the entire country. They wiped out illiteracy. They were making huge breakthroughs in art and science. But none of that matters to these people. No. Socialist countries are poor, and China is only rich because it's capitalist. The only reason China was a success is because it's capitalist, right? And the Soviet Union collapsed, right? So therefore it can't. It's like everything they achieved prior to the collapse can't be. You talk to these people, they are out of touch with reality. They have their belief system, their one true, capitalism is the greatest system ever, right? And whenever you start pointing out the flaws in any country that's capitalist, well, that's not real capitalism. And then, any country that's been successful with socialism, no, they're actually capitalist. There's no logic here. They believe what they believe. It's unquestionable ideology, and it's very, very dangerous because at the root of it is contempt for your fellow man. You read Ayn Rand, you read objectivism. These people believe that their fellow human beings are the enemy, that it should be every person for themselves, that selfishness is a virtue, that compassion is a form of weakness, that any form of human solidarity is dangerous. That's what these libertarian types believe, and that's why it's so dangerous. But anyhow, a lot to talk about here. And I think that the reality is that in the 1980s, the reform and opening up stuff played the opposite role, right? During the 1980s, the Soviet Union, their economy was stagnating a little bit. It wasn't producing as much as it had. They still had they still had full employment. They still had, a good life for most of the population, but they weren't producing as much as they had. They had some stagnation during the 1980s. And then on top of that, in the Soviet Union, you had a lot of middle class. I don't want to say middle class, but you had a lot of intellectuals, right? College professors, technicians, doctors, engineers, who felt stifled by a system in which everything was run by the government, right? They talk about in the Soviet Union, the restaurants were run by the government. The hotels were run by the government. Every consumer good was produced by the government. It was fully state-run. And the quality of a lot of the consumer goods wasn't very good. And on top of that, you had a lot of people who said, hey, I'm an engineer, I'm a technician, I'm a scientist, I could be doing a lot more, but I have to get permission from some government bureaucrat, and I feel stifled, I feel trapped. And Soros was basically able to manipulate the grievances of that section of Soviet society, right? And a lot of the protests that you saw, not just in the Soviet Union, but in East Germany and in Czechoslovakia, it was those folks, a lot of whom were very, very well educated, some of the most privileged people in these societies, right? Their parents were Communist Party leaders, but they had university education, and they felt stifled. And they, you asked them, a lot of them didn't even think they were protesting to overthrow socialism. A lot of them just said they were protesting for freedom, and they were convinced that they could keep their guaranteed job, keep their guaranteed housing, keep everything, but they wanted the ability to shop at Walmart, and they wanted the ability to listen to the Beatles and rock music, and they wanted to wear blue jeans, and they got suckered by George Soros, right? And they funded these protest movements, and they manipulated it, and they put factions into power that were more open to market reforms and things like that, and they were able to manipulate, to basically foment a political crisis in Eastern Europe, utilizing reform and opening up market reforms that let them slip in there, manipulating the grievances of the intellectuals and some of the privileged people. And basically, they were able to foment a political crisis and overthrow the Marxist-Leninist governments, put in neoliberal forces that sold off the economy and privatized everything and restored capitalism in Eastern Europe. Late 80s, early 90s, that's what was happening. And it was very successful for the Western capitalists. The result was the standard of living vastly decreasing, mass unemployment, mass starvation. Russia, I believe its population went down by roughly 10% of people just fleeing the country or dying. The drug trade vastly increased. Heroin was everywhere. People were dying of heroin. Suicide rates were very, very high. People had, lived their whole life with economic security, and it was just swept out from under them. A small group of people got very, very wealthy because they were the ones that got to sell off and got to buy the state-run industries. Most people lived in an extreme amount of poverty. It was a mess, right? I mean, the fall of the Soviet Union, was an economic disaster. And the overturn of socialism was an economic disaster all across Eastern Europe. And it was carried out by Soros and the USA manipulating a lot of different factors and staging that. And they tried to do the same thing in China, right? When Deng Xiaoping was reform and opening up, and there was an attempt by the West to utilize the reform and opening up in China and the friendliness between the Chinese government and the U.S. government to try and foment discontent and overthrow the Communist Party in China, and it didn't work. And actually, at this point, the Communist Party in China is stronger than it was under Mao and in the 70s. That's just a fact. That there is more support. And a lot of these people, the people that are the ones that Soros and others manipulate, they're big supporters. Why? Because the Chinese government is now supporting them and starting tech companies, for example, right? Jack Ma, right? I mean, the Chinese government has enabled him and supported him in starting Alibaba, right? And that these, these intellectuals, these people that are skilled, instead of the government stifling them and holding them back and kind of trapping them, and then them developing resentment against socialism and admiration for the West, the government in the socialist countries has found a way to, unleash these people and really let them fulfill their potential in a way that benefits socialism. And if you look at what the Sandinistas are doing in Nicaragua with their micro-entrepreneurship programs, or I even saw this in Venezuela when I was there. I mean, there's a building in Venezuela called the Center for African Knowledge. And the building that's been set up basically as a place to honor Venezuelans of African heritage. But all throughout the building, there are a lot of small craftsmen, people who make their own handbags and purses, people who make shoes, and they get a free store. It's like a mall for these small craftsmen, subsidized by the government, right? So that they're able to become small business owners, craftsmen, creators of, consumer goods, because this overall state-run economy, Venezuela's economy is entirely centered around oil, and the oil is in the hands of a revolutionary government, that by centering the economy around them and then allowing the market sector to spring up in other areas, they're actually able to utilize, these innovators and skilled people, utilize them, subsidize them, and unleash them to build socialism. At the end of the day, those folks are going to do what the party asks them to do. They get their subsidy from the government. They get their support from the government. So they're going to do what's overall in the interest of the country. They're controlled by the state. But they're doing, their creativity. They're allowed to have their new ideas and their innovation, to have their little corner of the world, their little business, their little tech company, and do it in a way that actually helps socialism in the long run. And that's what I think folks have learned from the fall of the Soviet Union. Restaurants should not be run by the government. People talk about how in the Soviet Union, you would get awful service if you went to a restaurant. They would just treat you really bad. Why? Because the less people that came to the restaurant, the more food they got to take home at the end of the night. Right? And so if very few people came to the restaurant, then the amount of food they got to take home at the end of the night was bigger. That's not a setup you want. Say, the restaurant was a worker co-op where all those who worked in it, from the waiters to the waitresses to the people who cooked, they all got a share of the profits. They'd all be working very, very hard to make it as good of a restaurant as possible, right? But if you run restaurants and hotels like you run steel mills in the Soviet Union, if you run, for example, if you run computer companies that way, it leads to a setup where innovation is stifled and people are reluctant to be creative. And if someone has a new idea, they're not heralded, they're not applauded. It's more like, oh, you're showing the rest of us up, aren't you? Oh, what, and that kind of attitude ultimately was what a lot of intellectuals and others had grievances with, and Soros and the CIA was able to manipulate that stuff and overthrow socialism in the Eastern Bloc. And China and the Deng Xiaoping theory and Vietnam and the Bolivarian countries have figured out a way to circumvent that. And they have actually turned it around where in a lot of these countries, those folks are the biggest supporters of socialism. In China now, the people who've been able to, start, small businesses or big businesses and start tech companies, they tend to be big supporters of the party. They say, look, the party has given me the support I would need. The party gave me education. The party invested in my business idea, and they tend to be supportive. And I've gone to international conferences. I went to the Yalta Economic Forum in Crimea. I met these folks, right? And they tend to be these business owners, these people who've been able to start their own businesses, been able to become capitalists through communist or socialist governments. They tend to be the biggest supporters of socialism, right? This is a different ballgame completely. And it's the knowledge of this, that's what's underlying the Korea talks. And Trump is, as much as I don't like Trump, immigration, not with him. I'm not a Trump supporter, did not vote for him, didn't vote for Hillary Clinton either, but I'm not a Trump supporter, but the fact that he's sticking to his guns shows that he's aligned with the Jim Rogers faction of American capital. They want to make a lot of money off of opening up trade with North Korea. And Soros and CIA and a lot of big corporations and the Heritage Foundation don't agree with them, right? And they think, no, we cannot give a Deng Xiaoping moment to the Korean Workers' Party. And that's basically the divide when it comes to the Korea talks. And there's a long-standing divide in the United States between big capital and I shouldn't even say big capital. There's a divide among the ruling class of the United States between the small circles of ultra-entrenched power, like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the DuPonts, and those elite families that have been running the USA almost from the beginning, and the other wealthy people in the United States. The Trump administration is full of capitalists that feel like they're not part of the club, that have been locked out. And that divide seems to define the period we're living in. We have the lower levels of capital with the Trump administration rising up against the very, very entrenched circles of power. And that's really what's happening there. Looking at the comments section here, I'm seeing all kinds of stuff here. I think someone's trying to get me rattled, but I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. Thoughts on the attack on the DPRK in Spain, embassy in Spain. Again, that's actually what I was referring to. It seems pretty clear that somebody doesn't want the USA and North Korea to keep negotiating. And that's what that tells me. I don't know who that somebody is. People in Spain, like mainstream sources in Spain, are saying that individuals who carried out that attack are linked to the CIA. That's what mainstream sources are saying. That's not what I'm saying. That's what mainstream sources in Spain are saying. And it seems to me like there are certain forces that really don't want a rapprochement between North Korea. And the fact that Congress made these huge new sanctions against North Korea and then Trump refused to implement them, that's big. And hey, the Mueller report, right? No collusion. It wasn't happening, right? This Russiagate narrative that Trump's election was all a vast conspiracy from Russia against our American way of life. It's been, that didn't happen, right? And Bob Mueller, with all this millions of dollars in the federal government, he could not find any collusion between Trump and Russia. We're waiting to see the full report, but he's not recommending any further indictments. All the indictments that came down had absolutely nothing to do with Russian collusion. There were people who were indicted for lying to the FBI. So, it was the crime they committed was after the investigation started. If they'd never talked to the FBI, they wouldn't have been indicted for it. So there's people that lied to the investigators. That's what they're charged with. There's been, allegations that Paul Manafort has ties to some foundation in the Ukraine. But no collusion, the vast conspiracy of Trump and Russia conspiring against our great American way of life, the Russian subversion, the Ruskies, that whole narrative, Bob Mueller didn't find anything. Now, the Democrats, I'm sure they're going to keep this going, but there you go. And that's the way our media really, really is. And that brings me to this left McCarthyism that we're seeing. right? And I got to tell you, folks, right? During the Cold War, I've made this point before. During the Cold War, the far right wing in the United States, they were basically turned into defenders of the political establishment. The John Birch Society, right? There was a lot of these different groups. The American Legion. You talk to those folks, they were far right-wingers, and they were against both the Democrats and the Republicans. They thought both the Democrats and the Republicans were communists. They thought the American system had been betrayed. They had their own ideology. But at the end of the day, what did they do? They went around beating up anti-war protesters. They went around, they were just enforcing the establishment. They went around chasing communists and accusing people of being communists, and they were about being against communism, being against anyone who might slightly have an interest in communism. They weren't defined what they were for. If you ask them what they were for, liberty. And I think the John Birch Society, their slogan was, what is it? For peace, liberty, and with God's help, a better world. I mean, it was vague, right? They were just against communism. And right now, in left-wing circles, there's a real rise of what I'd call left Bircherism, where instead of being for socialism, instead of being for overturning capitalism, instead of criticizing the current, system, instead, it's just about being against fascists. And what is a fascist? No one can tell you, they can't give you a straight answer about what a fascist is. However, they can draw you a bunch of charts and graphs about how everyone they disagree with can somehow be traced back to Russia, right? And it's all because of Russia. And, just remember when Glenn Beck had that chalkboard during the Obama years, and he'd be like, Obama is friends with Andy Stern. And Andy Stern, the head of SIAU, when he was young, he was in SDS. And SDS studied the writings of Mao Zedong. And so therefore, Barack Obama is a Maoist, and he's remember that? Do you remember Glenn Beck doing that? I do. And now it's the lefties that are out there with the chalkboard. It's the Rachel Maddow liberals. It's like, well, Trump, with Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon met with so-and-so. So-and-so met with so-and-so. So-and-so went to Russia. So therefore, Russia in Trump. And it's stupid. And it's not real politics. And at the end of the day, it's defense of the establishment. Why do the rulers of the United States not like Vladimir Putin? Is it because they think he's just not pro-LGBT enough? No. Is it because they think he's violating human rights? No. The reason that leaders of the United States don't like Vladimir Putin is really simple and economic. And it has nothing to do with Vladimir Putin's personality. It has nothing to do with his position on social issues. Put all of that aside, right? The reason they don't like Vladimir Putin is because when Vladimir Putin came to office, he saved the Russian economy. In the 1990s, Russia had free market capitalism, neoliberalism, unregulated free market capitalism. The economy of Russia during the 1990s, they were letting the free market run rampant. Bill Browder was in there working with BP and HSBC Bank, and they were looting the country economically. And Jeffrey Sachs was the economist, and he was advising them on how to sell off the state industries. People were dying and suffering. The 1990s was a disastrous free market experiment in Russia. They deregulated, they privatized everything, they sold things off. It was a nightmare. It was just an utter nightmare. And, lo and behold, Vladimir Putin got elected and gradually began the process of reorganizing the Russian economy around two big corporations, Gazprom and Rosneft, two big corporations. And what's funny is that he wrote about this in his PhD thesis, right? This is a guy who was studying political economy in college, right? Getting his PhD thesis. He wrote a PhD thesis about the concept of what he called national champions. And in his thesis, you can read his thesis. It's on the internet. He quotes Adam Smith. He quotes Marx. He quotes different political theorists. And he kind of comes up with this concept of how you can rescue a country's economy by centering it around a national champion, which is a big corporation that the government facilitates and controls. So he built Gazprom and Rosneft, which already existed. These two state-controlled companies, one does oil, the other does natural gas, and he basically reorganized Russia's economy to be centered around these two state-controlled energy corporations. Two state-controlled energy corporations that therefore can subsidize the rebirth of a domestic economy. That's what Vladimir Putin did. In the 1990s, Russia's farm system collapsed. Like 80% of the collective farms in the USSR went out of business. Right? They started having to import all their food from the United States. Right now, under Putin is using that oil and gas money, and he's completely rebuilt the Russian agricultural system. Right? They're growing their own wheat. They're growing their own crops. The Russian, they've got steak and beef they're growing over there. Basically, by creating Gazprom and Rosneft, Putin has made Russia economically independent, right? It's not dependent on the West. It is not a captive market anymore. They're not being plundered by Western corporations. They have economic independence. They stand on their own 2 feet. And no matter what Vladimir Putin was like, if he was, if he was a nice guy, if he was a mean guy, if he was socially liberal, if he was socially conservative, anybody who does that is an enemy of the West, right? Because it's about monopolism. It's about control of the global markets. And because Vladimir Putin was able to reboot the Russian economy based on his unique economic theories around the concept of national champions, they hate him. That's what it's about. That's what Russiagate is about. That's what the U.S. crisis and the manufactured situation in Ukraine is about. That's what Rachel Maddow on her show every night going, Russia, 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 Russia. That's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. It is about the fact that Putin has rebooted the Russian economy, made Russia no longer an economic captive market, made it economically independent and stand on its own 2 feet, and they think that's a threat. And at the end of the day, that's why they hate, the Chinese government, too, is because China has stood up and raised itself up out of poverty, and it's making its own cell phones, it's making its own steel, it's raised itself up. They want to control the market. They want the world to be poor and dependent on them. They want the world as a captive market. They want the world to be desperately poor and dependent on Western multinational gigantic corporations. And that's why the IMF and the World Bank, that's why they exist. It's about ensuring a monopoly. That's what neoliberalism is all about. And during the Cold War, there was a big divide because the Kennedy administration, Johnson administrations, even Eisenhower a little bit, had this idea that, okay, to defeat the Soviets, we're going to let countries in the developing world have a little bit of economic independence. And they allowed a layer of nationalism to develop in the developing world. I mean, in Argentina and in Chile, the USA, basically, because both the countries were capitalist countries, they were aligned with the United States in the Cold War, they let them use the government to build up a middle class. Right? And in South Korea, I mean, that's just the Asian tigers. That was very much what happened all across Asia, is the United States, in order to have these countries aligned with them, allowed them to use the government, because it was the government that did it. It was Bonapartist government policies, whether you go to South Korea, whether you go to Taiwan, Hong Kong, all of these countries, huge level of state involvement in the economy. And the USA, in order to keep them as allies against the communists, allowed these countries to have a level of development. And then neoliberalism and the rise of Milton Friedman, starting out in 1973 in Chile and then spreading in the 80s and then really taking off in the 1990s, was the USA revoking it and saying, hey, we don't need the communists anymore. There's no danger of communist revolution. We don't need you to have this big middle class anymore. Yeah, we had to tolerate you building up your middle class and having your own economy. We don't need that anymore. And so Milton Friedman and all of them, they went into Chile, and Milton Friedman very famously, Milton Friedman said to his people from the Chicago school when he went into Chile after the coup with Pinochet, he said to them very famously, "Our enemy is not Karl Marx. Our enemy is Juan Perón, the Bonapartist, the anti-imperialist and Bonapartist leader in Argentina." And that Peronism, that kind of nationalism, that kind of populism, that Bonapartist populism that had created a middle class that the USA had tolerated during the Cold War in a lot of Latin American countries, that's what they were getting rid of. They were revoking the Keynesian consensus. After the end of the Second World War, there was this feeling that the Second World War had been caused by the Great Depression. Right? And the Great Depression showed that we need the government to spend money, we need the government to control the economy, so we don't have a Great Depression, so we don't have communists and fascists, and we don't have a Second World War again. That was the Keynesian consensus. And Milton Friedman and neoliberalism was the USA, after the fall of the Soviet Union, basically saying, you know what, we don't need the Keynesian consensus anymore. This idea that we should make sure people are not unemployed, what's that about? This idea that we should build up and let countries in the third world develop themselves. Why do we need that anymore, right? And that the Keynesian consensus, the feeling that in order to defeat the communists, as John F. Kennedy very famously put it, he said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. The feeling among the U.S. ruling class that you don't need that you should allow people in the developing world to have a piece of the pie so they don't have communist revolutions. That was being revoked, and that was what that was about. And I saw that somebody in the comments section or in the thing was asking about UBI and universal basic income. And I want to talk about that because I must say the jury is still out on that. I haven't made up my own mind about what I think about it. I'm watching this Andrew Yang guy. I'm watching all the presidential candidates, by the way, just so you know. I'm a journalist. I don't play favorites. I'm not campaigning for anybody. I like a lot of what Bernie Sanders is saying. I don't like a lot of what Bernie Sanders is saying. I like a lot of what Tulsi Gabbard is saying. I don't like a lot of what Tulsi Gabbard is saying. I like a lot of what Mike Gravel is saying, but I also don't like a lot of what Mike Gravel is saying. I like a lot of what Andrew Yang is saying, but I also don't like a lot of what Andrew Yang is saying, and that's why I want to talk about universal basic income, because the jury is still out. I haven't made up my mind about it. On the one hand, I think that what Andrew Yang is saying about automation is totally on point, right? That we are getting rid of the jobs that used to exist, and that there are going to be a lot of people who won't have a role at the assembly line, and that as artificial intelligence moves in, the kind of jobs that we'll need humans to do is drastically shrinking. That's a very good point. I'm glad he's making that point. And the idea that if you could free people from economic desperation, you could get rid of a lot of the social ills, right? If people had a basic income, the amount of people that would resort to criminal activity would go down. The amount of people that would, use drugs to deal with stress would go down, right? And that you could get rid of a lot of bad, social ills if you, had some big, universal safety net. And I think that's a very good point. And I think he's a very interesting candidate, and a lot of what he says seems to be on point. But there is another side to this. And I remember about 2 years ago, there was an article advocating universal basic income written by Charles Murray. Now, do folks know who Charles Murray is? He's the author of a book called The Bell Curve. It's a book that basically argues some races are naturally less intelligent than others, been ripped to shreds by all kinds of academics, never subject to peer review. It's racial pseudoscience from the 1980s. And this guy is a right-wing, conservative, advocate of neoliberalism, but he's pushing the idea of universal basic income. And he pushes this in the Wall Street Journal. And the argument he gives for it is this, right? If everyone just gets $1,000 a month from the government, we can get rid of the Department of the unemployment, the Department of Labor that does unemployment, right? Get rid of it. All the bureaucrats that oversee who gets their unemployment insurance, just get rid of them. All those good-paying government jobs of people whose job it is to administer unemployment insurance, make sure people are getting it, get rid of them. And we can get rid of, the Department of Agriculture, the food stamps section, right? We won't need food stamps. Everyone just gets an automatic bank transfer. We'll get rid of the Department of Agriculture, all the people overseeing food stamps, making sure people get them get rid of them. Section 8, all the people that get rent assistance. Well, we can get rid of that program, right? And just get rid of all the good-paying government workers who do that. Get rid of it. We got rid of that. You can get rid of thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of government jobs, good-paying government jobs, with universal basic income. And Charles Murray was basically advocating it for that reason. And one thing that comes to my mind when you talk about universal basic income is and Andrew Yang, he's been asked about this, and he says that that's the idea, right? Is that people that get government assistance will eventually get the choice. Do you want to get your universal basic income, which will be more than your government assistance, or do you want to keep getting government assistance? They'll all choose universal basic income because it's more money. And so that'll lead to the elimination of a lot of government jobs. And then that raises another question, which is there are laws on the books, for example, in a number of states that that in order to get government assistance like food stamps, you have to take a drug test. Why? Because, and I mean, I'm not even necessarily saying I'm against this, because there's this feeling that we shouldn't be subsidizing people who use drugs, right? That, that if someone is a drug user, we shouldn't be enabling them, right? We should let them rock bottom so that they can get help with their addiction. But with universal basic income, right? With universal basic income, that raises the question. If someone's convicted of using drugs, do they automatically lose their money? Right? Oh, you have a drug arrest. So, you're $1,000 a month, gone. What do you do then, right? And it's not like, with food stamps, people can still get their food stamps if they're convicted of a crime. I mean, you just have to, but with universal basic income, there's only one source of government assistance. One. And everyone gets it, no matter who they are. One, you get it no matter who you are. Suddenly, you have the ability to start talking about undesirable people. And this scares me, right? The government, first they start saying, you know what? Why should we? Do you really want $1,000 to go to child molesters and murderers and rapists who've gotten out of jail? And most people are going to say, yeah, I don't want to be giving $1,000 of my tax money to some, child rapist or some drug user and all that. So then you're taking the money away from certain undesirable people. And then what happens to those people, right? I'm telling you, there's some questions I have about it, right? That it could pave the way to eugenics in some ways. I'm afraid of it. But on the other hand, I think that a lot of what Andrew Yang is saying is good, right? And that he's right, that we need to figure out a post-automation economy, and that what Jack Ma has said about how in the past we trained people to be like machines, but now we have machines that are like people, that can do everything. And I heard Jack Ma say that when I was at Valdi Discussion Club. I was just maybe 10, 20, 30 feet away from him when he said it, and it really had an impact on me. So you need, on some level, right? You do need, to figure out how people can be taken care of. And if people were not afraid, if they were not economically desperate, we would get rid of a lot of societal ills. If everyone had a basic economic structure, right? If people were not worried about food and housing, if they could get by, right? If everyone could basically get by, the country would be much better off. So I agree with it. My fear, though, is what happens to all those government jobs, those good-paying government jobs, which are a subsidy into the economy, which are going to be lost. Public workers, they're unionized, they get higher wages than the private sector in a lot of cases. They have much more job security. And does this then open the door to, we're just going to start delisting people, and people are not going to get, they're not going to get their social credit if they're, convicted of drug use, or they're going to have to take a drug test every month in order to make sure they keep getting their UBI, or, after people get out of prison, they won't get it, and gradually, that worries me, right? But now Andrew Yang, as someone's pointing out, now Kyle, or Kyle, is saying that that Andrew Yang has said that criminals would get it after they get out of jail. Again, so that, again, is in Andrew Yang's favor. I've got questions about UBI. I'm not totally for it. I'm not totally against it, and I think it's an interesting conversation. And I'm glad Andrew Yang is raising it, honestly. I think it's a very, very interesting conversation. And I'm on the fence. I can hear some of the strong arguments for it. I can hear a lot of what Andrew Yang is saying, but I also have my reservations, I mean, every so often you'll hear something from the establishment that sounds really, really liberal, but the more you dig into it, the more you realize it's actually something really, really rotten. For example, universal, what is it? I believe it's called universal service. This is an idea that Democrats have pushed for a long time, right? Joe Biden, and who's that guy from Baltimore who ran for president last time? And it's this national service initiative. It sounds great, right? That every young person should, after they graduate from high school, before they go to college, they should be required to do something to help the country, right? Maybe they can go into the military, maybe they can, volunteer or something like that. And this, we should encourage every young person for 2 years after they graduate from high school to just do something good, serve the community. It sounds really good. Sounds really, really nice. Here's the problem with it. What all these young people that'll be doing, if they don't go into the military, what they'll be doing is the jobs of government workers. And they'll be doing them for free. Think about it, right? Well, we need we got thousands of young people, 2 years of their life, they just have to work for free for the government. Okay, they can start delivering the mail. Okay, they can start, cleaning the streets. Oh, get rid of all your sanitation work. And you can get rid of all these high-paying government jobs and replace them with young people that are just, they're putting in their 2 years that's good for the country, It's just, and think about it, right? That's austerity. And that it sounds good. Volunteerism. Clinton pushed that like crazy, right? Volunteerism. Young people need to be mandated. Their schools need to require young people to do so many hours of volunteerism a week. I'm not against that in principle. I'm glad people are going out and working and helping the country. I believe in community service. But the way it gets implemented from above, it's a mechanism for getting rid of the jobs of government workers and getting that big subsidy, right? All the government workers have families, they spend money, they have high incomes, they have union protection, it eliminates them, right? So it's a part of a war against public workers, right? I mean, Teach for America, right? The Teach for America program that Obama did. It sounded really good, right? That if you get your college degree and you go and teach in a low-income area, we will pay for your college. Sounds like a great program. Here's the thing. You don't get union representation when you go there. You get paid way lower than the teachers that are already there get paid, right? And the more Teach for America teachers are, the weaker the teachers' unions are, and it's It's pretty rotten, right? It overall, it's part of a basic way to lower the pay of teachers, to hurt the power of teachers' unions, to make education in the United States much more private. Teach for America. On the surface, it sounds good, but in principle, it's basically a way to hurt teachers and to hurt the American educational system, right? Think about it. So, a lot of times there'll be things that sound really progressive on the surface that actually underlying it are somewhat sinister. So that's why the jury is still out on UBI. I don't know what to think about universal basic income, right? Kinky says an unsuspecting scab, basically, yeah. And that's why the jury is still out. And the other thing is I'm not endorsing any candidate. And let's be clear about that. There are things that Bernie Sanders says that I strongly disagree with. Do I retweet him every so often? Sure. Do I retweet Tulsi Gabbard every so often? Sure. Do I retweet Mike Gravel? I just retweeted him once. But I might do it again, right? I retweeted Andrew Yang. They're saying interesting things, but I'm not endorsing any candidate. And all of them, I can't think of any candidate who's totally in line with how I see things. And that's fine, right? We should all be able to just kind of talk about these things. I will say that the kids that are Bernie Sanders supporters are awesome. And a lot of these young people that are rallying around kind of the Democratic Socialist current within the Democratic Party are just great people. And I mean, a lot of the people I know are involved in that current of politics. And these are people who are just full of optimism and hope. They want to help their country. And they're really doing what everyone should be doing right now. Because all around us in the United States right now, we're just drowning in pessimism. Pessimism is everywhere, whether it's the left or the right or the fictional movies on TV. Everything is all pessimism. The world is about to end. Everything is coming to fall apart. Oh, the world. Pessimism is everywhere. And I really believe that it is part of the responsibility of everyone who lives in a society to be optimistic on some level. Right? Maybe you don't like the current system. Well, organize for a new system. I mean, I'm not saying you have to agree with things, but you should always be looking about to the future, always keeping your head up. How can I make the world a better place, right? And that if you get stuck in that pessimism, that ultimately leads to societal decay, right? That people need to have optimism. And that's very, very important. And I see nothing but optimism coming out of the Bernie people. They're mad. They're negative about the current system, but they're not full of hate and negativity. They're full of optimism and hope. And the Trump movement, I mean, that's a lot of old folks that are very pessimistic. I actually saw a poll that a lot of the Trump people, when Trump was being voted for, they didn't really believe Trump would make their life better. They just believed he would punish and make life worse for a lot of people they were mad at. I kid you not. There were polls that showed that. People didn't believe Trump was going to make their life better, but they hoped that he would punish somebody that they were mad at. That's awful. That is an awful place to be in your life, where you're just like, yeah, my life sucks. It's not going to get any better, but I want to see somebody else suffer for a change. Yeah, I want to see somebody else get hurt. That's an awful place to be psychologically. You want to talk about a bad, unhealthy place. I mean, that's the mindset of people that are either suicidal or homicidal. That's a death mindset. That is a death mindset. You don't want to be there. You want to struggle in all things to try and be an optimistic person, to try and believe that you can make things better. Now, Lady Ravenhair says, well, there is hope. We need to change things. I agree, Lady Ravenhair. I mean, it's in all things, you got to be optimistic. You got to try to have the diet beverage glass that will not be named, be half full, not half empty, as they say. And it's not simply a matter of you'll be happier if you do that. I think it's good for society. It's almost your obligation to keep your head up, to keep looking toward better things. You can be frustrated, but you always got to be thinking, how could things be better? What could I do to make things better? It's funny. There was an old man that I knew, and he was a communist activist, but, he would recite a poem to me. I'm sure I've recited it on here before, but it's one of my favorite works of poetry. And I believe it's anonymous. People don't know who quoted it, who wrote it. I just think it's beautiful. And I really, as my life was changing, as I was transitioning out of being an activist and becoming a journalist and a political commentator and an analyst like I am now, this poem really spoke to me. And it really speaks to me. And I feel like it's one of those things. It's not explicitly political. It's not something that I feel like it's something that people can relate to. I've quoted it many times, and I'll quote it again. So if you don't like it, if you think it's corny, cover your ears. It'll be over a little soon. But this poem called "The Wrecking Crew," as the title it often has, that poem really speaks to, I feel, how people, if you're a leftist especially, you should be approaching the world. So I'll recite this poem that a lot of people think is corny, but that's okay. I like it, right? Bear with me. Here goes. On a busy street, in a busy town, I saw them tearing a building down. With a ho-heave-ho and a lusty yell, the men swung a beam, and the sidewall fell. So I said to the foreman, "Are these men skilled, like those you would hire if you wanted to build?" The foreman just smiled and said, "No, indeed. Why, common labor is all that I need. For a wrecker can wreck in a week or two that which took builders years to do." So I thought to myself as I walked away, which of these roles have I tried to play? Am I a builder who builds with care, measuring life with a compass and square? Am I living my life by a well-made plan and striving to do the best that I can? Or am I that type that scours the town, content with the labor of tearing things down? I love that poem. It really points toward the outlook that you should have in life. You should always be a builder, right? You should always be trying to make the world a better place. That's my attitude, and it's always much easier to just be hopeless and complain and gripe about the world. Now, someone's asking me, didn't the Chinese Communist Party promote cooperatives? Well, cooperative farming in particular, and that's the agricultural system. But there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things in this world that are worth pointing out. I live in my neighborhood here in Brooklyn. Before I did this live, I went to my favorite burger place, had a good burger. And I noticed they were having the St. Patrick's Day parade in my neighborhood. It was just coming to an end. I had no idea. They don't send me a memo and tell me what day they're going to have their St. Patrick's Day parade. St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, but, whatever. So they're having their parade. And I thought it was kind of funny because, my neighborhood is historically an Irish neighborhood. But now, it's very few Irish folks. There's a lot of folks from the Middle East here, a lot of Latinos, a lot of Chinese Americans here in my neighborhood. And as I saw this parade going by, I saw all these Catholic schools locally in my neighborhood with, big Irish banners, and I saw kids from Central America and kids from China and kids from, from the Middle East, all marching in the St. Patrick's Day parade, which is this big Irish celebration. Thought it was a little bit ironic. And there you go. But springtime is an interesting time. Now, I've often speculated that I feel like there's something seasonal about the energy of people. For example, in the summertime, I've noticed with politics and with world events, things slow down. Same in the wintertime. In the wintertime, you got the holidays going on. In the summertime, everything's so hot. Summertime and wintertime, things slow down. But in the fall and in the spring, things heat up. They heat up. There's a lot more activity. I don't know what that's about, right? Spring and fall, much more activity. Winter, summer, people slow down. I think that's interesting, right? And, people want to relate it to the seasons and astrology and equinoxes and whatever, folks. I've noticed that. It seems like in the fall, September, October, November are always very busy months. March, April, May, always very busy months. But June, July, August, things slow down. December, January, February, things seem to slow down. I don't know what it's about. I feel like there's an energy in the world. And, if you go to countries that are closer to the equator, it's not like that. And I wonder if they have the same patterns because I feel like that's how these things happen. Now, David is saying the Ukrainian coup took place in February. So maybe that goes against what I'm saying. I don't know. But there you go. And the other thing, people recall that the Iraq War started on March 19th, 2003. The USA invaded Iraq. And do a lot of wars begin in the spring? It seems like it. But what do I know? What do I know about all this? But I've got plenty to talk about, folks. A lot on my mind. But let's talk. Ask me about what's on your mind. What is it people want to discuss? I'm all ears, right? Right? So much happening in the world. The world is changing constantly. The world is constantly changing. The Black Panthers did cool things from a moralistic perspective, says someone calling themselves Nicholas the Bird. I think the Black Panther Party is a fascinating organization. And I actually, there's a lot written about it. I would encourage people to read We Want Freedom A Life in the Black Panther Party by Mumia Abu-Jamal. I learned a lot from that book. What was fascinating is Mumia Abu-Jamal talks about his own experiences as a teenager in the Black Panthers, and then he goes over kind of an academic, a very carefully written academic history of the Black Panther Party. That's very fascinating. I would encourage people to check that out. And there's a lot written about it. And what I think is important is that there was a big line struggle in the Black Panther Party between Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton. And that line struggle that took place, probably around 1969, 1970, which the Black Panther Party split, I think that's very, very important because within the Black Panther Party, you had, and at one point they actually called them, there were two Black Panthers parties. They called it the Black Panther Party Newton and the Black Panther Party Cleaver. And that was a division. And if you look at that, it was basically over the question of what do we do next? And that Eldridge Cleaver, he put forward the perspective that they needed to engage in ultra-left terrorist adventurist activity. He and his group, they went around killing police officers. They eventually fled to Cuba. And that they believed it was time to engage in armed violence, right? And the Panthers, they had done their armed patrol thing, so guns were part of their identity. But interestingly, Huey Newton repudiated that. And he said, actually, what they should do is what he called survival pending revolution. And that's how they created the free breakfast program, where they started giving breakfast to people in low-income neighborhoods. And that's how, he created, they created, an ambulance service for low-income people. And they started doing all kinds of social programs to take care of people. And the FBI was far, far more afraid of the Black Panther Party Newton than they were of the Black Panther Party Cleaver. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover said that the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States was the free breakfast program. Why? Because unemployed people, low-income people, low-income children were getting breakfast before school along with revolutionary ideology. While they were eating their free breakfast, they were getting revolutionary teachings and principles. And that's why Richard Nixon, the conservative right-wing president, created the school breakfast program to get the kids away from the Black Panthers and into the schools to get their free breakfast. That's where the breakfast program came from. Because there is a fear, right? It is far more dangerous to feed people, to care for people. That's far more dangerous to the system than it is to run out there and do crazy acts of violence, right? And they knew that, right? And I think that's particularly fascinating. And that the Black Panthers as a group, they repudiated left adventurism. They knew that at the beginning, that the armed patrols and the right to bear arms that had been necessary at the beginning, according to Huey Newton's biography, it was necessary to kind of grab the attention and the imagination of people. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it was far, far more dangerous to the system to do constructive activities, right? To care for people. When the old system is crumbling, when people are left behind, you care for those who are in need, and then you're laying the seeds of a new society, right? And that it was similar to what the Communist Party did with the unemployment councils and the bonus march and their activities in Brooklyn, New York, and in Chicago and in Detroit, right? That feeding people and caring for people while teaching them a new ideology, while filling them up with a new way of understanding the world that is opposed to the status quo, that's far more dangerous to the system than people engaging in crazy acts of terrorism and violence. Lady Ravenhair is saying that she thinks that the CIA was involved. Well, we know that the CIA was involved in what she referred to, which is the Red Brigades in Italy. That in the years of lead, they called it, in Italy, the CIA was funding both communists and fascists in order to engage in terrorism and violence in Italy because they feared that the Italian Communist Party, which was against left adventurism, which was a legit political organization with millions of members, they feared that they would win the elections. And so the CIA had this program called Operation Gladio. This is all documented. You can look this up. To basically fund ultra-leftist terrorists and fund fascist terrorists to create chaos in Italy to make people afraid to vote for the Communist Party. And it was quite successful. It resulted in a lot of chaos, and ultimately we know the Italian Communist Party never really won the elections. And people don't talk about that. And yes, there were in Italy, you had years of chaos, basically, with the CIA on both sides. The U.S. Central Intelligence agencies were funding both sides, Italian fascists and Italian communists, pushing both of them to be violent in order to prevent the non-violent Communist Party from getting elected. Keep that in mind, right? That the ultra-left and the ultra-right were utilized to create a chaotic situation where people would be afraid of voting for the communists, right? And that kind of thing happens. It totally does, and that's worth exploring. Now, David says the CIA funded Trotskyists too, and there have been a number of instances where that's been documented, right? We know about Partisan Review magazine that was funded by the CIA, the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. There's there's a number of instances where the Trotskyites were getting support from the U.S. government, and that's been documented, and that if you put out a vague critique of capitalism, but you ultimately side with the status quo whenever it matters, there you go. Now, someone says, "Psst, Caleb is a hologram or an hologram." I think I'm real. Do I look real to you? I mean, my hand feels real. These books behind me feel real. The pillow I'm sitting on feels real. But hey, what do you know? I'm sitting here in my Brooklyn apartment. I've got my video, my iPhone here on the screen in front of me. I'm sitting on the ground. I've got my camera propped up on my coffee table. I'm sitting on a nice pillow I took from my couch. I'm sitting in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. I think I'm real. But do any of us know we're real, right? This is going to turn into a philosophy conversation. Now, Inundation says, no, you're real AF. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think I'm real. Are you real? Right? What is the nature of reality anyway, right? Right? Fun times we're having here. I think one thing that's very clear, and this is a point I wanted to make earlier, is that there's a divide between the USA and Europe. And that the Obama administration was very, very much all about, they were all about basically trying to keep the USA and the NATO countries in Europe together. You'll remember that Obama actually went to Berlin during his campaign. He took time off from campaigning in the United States for people who could actually vote for him and went to Berlin and spoke to thousands of people in Berlin. And that the Obama administration was all about ensuring kind of a unity between the USA and the NATO countries in Europe. Meanwhile, Trump has had the opposite. He's been accusing the NATO countries of not paying enough money into the military budgets, making the USA handle the burden, and he's been, he supported Brexit, which weakened the EU, and that Trump has been kind of going out of his way to offend Europe. And that it's interesting because Latin America is an issue that Europe and the USA have long disagreed about. In the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was funding the Contras in Nicaragua, fomenting civil war in Nicaragua and El Salvador, Europe was against that. They were very, very much against that. And that is why the Pope and the Vatican was very, very critical of it. And you saw priests and nuns protesting against U.S. policy in Latin America. And largely that's because Latin American countries, the attitude in the United States is they're the country's backyard. They're the U.S. backyard, right? They're the monopoly of the United States. And there's a feeling that there was a change in Latin America that would open the doors to more trade with European corporations. And there's a lot of European countries that are fully capitalist that do business with Cuba, for example, where the United States doesn't. There's a lot of European corporations that do business with Cuba. And there's a feeling that if Latin American countries were to break out and establish economic independence, that would create an opening for European capital to get in there. And the USA, and a lot of times when they're fighting against communists in Latin America, they're fighting to maintain their monopoly. Latin America, it's the Monroe Doctrine, that it's their backyard, and Latin America will be a captive market for U.S. corporations and not for European corporations. And that's long-standing. And around that time, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union was trying to fix some of its economic stagnation, and it started trying to sell oil and natural gas to West Germany. And you had the rise of the Green Party in West Germany, and you had West German leaders that were open to doing business with the Soviet Union. And then the Saudis dropped the oil price, right? And that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, started churning oil onto the international markets and dropped the oil price. And that really hurt the economy of the Soviet Union. And that there was a divide in the 80s with Europe saying basically that Reagan should, leave Latin America alone, and Reagan and the United States basically funding the Contras and the extremists. And that divide seems to be very well alive. I think that while a lot of European countries may not like Maduro and may not like Bolivarian socialism, they don't approve of Trump escalating things the way he's doing. And this divide is very big. And I will say this, okay, and this may sound a little bit weird to people, but look, I'll tell you, whenever I have been to an anti-imperialist country, I see a lot of German products. When I was in Iran, the only foreign car that people drove was a BMW, right? And even that, because of the sanctions, the price was greatly inflated. But Iranians who didn't have Iranian-made cars, there's two like Iranian government-controlled, corporations that make cars locally. Iranians who didn't have Iranian-made cars, they all had BMWs. When I was in Brazil, I noticed a lot of BMWs. I noticed a lot of, I was in the elevators in the buildings. They all had, the name of, Tyson and the German Steel Corporation. They made their elevators, right? When I was in Ecuador, when I was in Venezuela, I saw a lot of German products. Right? When I was in Russia, I saw a lot of German products, a lot of trade between Germany and Russia. Why? They're right next to each other. It makes sense, right? And there's Nord Stream 2, this natural gas pipeline that's bringing gas to Germany, right? Russian gas. And that the Germans, there's no reason for the Germans to hate the Russians. It's just not in their economic interest to have a war with the Russians. The Russians, are right next to them. They've got a lot of oil and gas. The Germans want to get along with the Russians. The Russians want to get along with the Germans. But the USA runs NATO, and the British run NATO, and they don't want the Germans to get along with them. And there's no real reason for the Germans to hate the Chinese either, right? And there's no real reason for the Germans to hate the socialist countries of Latin America. And that World War II and World War I were basically we're driven by an underlying reality. Obviously, there were huge political developments that escalated the whole thing, and fascism, and yes, but underlying World War I and World War II was just the simple fact that Germany is a Western capitalist imperialist country that has always been the odd man out among Western capitalist imperialist countries. That's just a fact, right? The British were the first in the game of imperialism with their textile industry, and they're colonizing India, and they're colonizing Africa. They were the first out, the first horse out of the gate. They were the leading capitalists. They declined after the Second World War. The USA moved in and became the top dog. But the Germans, the fact that they consolidated as a country pretty late. They were the Holy Roman Empire, and the Germans have never really been the top dog. They've never really been equal partners with the French, with the British, with the Americans. They've always been kind of, in last place among Western capitalist countries. They have. That's a reality. World War I was basically the Germans fighting with the British and the Americans and the French over the colonized world. And the Germans aligned with the Austrians and the Hungarians and the Ottoman Empire to basically try and push back the British and the Americans and the French. And they lost, and, they lost all their colonies. They were stripped of their colonies. And then eventually you had the rise of Adolf Hitler, and if you read, there's a very good book. You want to understand the economics of what World War II was really about, you ought to read this book called Hitler's Banker, which is a biography of Hjalmar Schacht, who was the main economist of Nazi Germany. And yes, Hitler and fascism, there was a whole ideology there, but what was underlying all of it was the fact, basically, that the German capitalists were being kicked around by the British and American capitalists, and also faced the threat of communist revolution. And the rise of fascism was basically the German capitalists, standing up to the American and British capitalists, but also killing and murdering the communists and establishing kind of an authoritarian state so they could control themselves. And Hjalmar Schacht, the economist, who was the economist of Nazi Germany, he basically incarnated that. And that World War I and World War II, just like World War I, was those German capitalists feeling like they were being kicked around by the American and British capitalists asserting themselves, right? And that contradiction that drove World War I, that drove World War II. And that contradiction has not gone away. As we see the USA basically trying to twist the arm of Germany and tell them they can't buy Russian oil and gas, they have to import their natural gas all the way from the United States. Do you know how much more money that's going to cost? It's going to triple or at least double their cost of natural gas. And the Americans trying to tell them, no, Germany, you have to buy your gas from us, from the United States. That's just not in their economic interest, right? I mean, one of the anecdotes that's in the book Hitler's Banker about Hjalmar Schacht is that Germany, one of Hitler's big moves is he refused to pay back the loans to American banks, right? When he came to power, he canceled all of Germany's debt to American banks. And Hjalmar Schacht is the one who delivered that news to U.S. President Roosevelt. And he said to Roosevelt, he said, we're not going to pay back our debts. And Roosevelt laughed. He laughed. And he said, ha, serves those Wall Street guys right. Right? That's a fact. That happened. And again, that's pointing to this reality that the economics that underlied both World War I and World War II are very well alive. The Germans, they're an imperialist country, they're a capitalist country, they're a Western country, but they've basically been screwed. They're still occupied by NATO troops. They're hosting U.S. military forces there. And there is a lot of people in Germany on all different sides, far left, De Linke, Sarah Wagenknecht, I believe is her name, and there's a lot of people in the left party in Germany. There's a lot of people in this new Alternative for Deutschland party. Basically, their grievance is that Germany gets kicked around by the United States and the British, and it's not allowed to really be a full partner in Western capitalism and imperialism. And that contradiction is very well alive. And the fact that I saw German products all over Iran, I saw German products all over Russia, I saw German products all over Venezuela, I saw German products all over Ecuador and Brazil. When I was in Brazil, when Dilma Rousseff was still in office before the 2016 coup. That's how I actually met Michel Temer, which people have seen the photo of me and Michel Temer. That's when he was still pretending to support the socialists before he, whatever, long story. But, I gave a speech in Brazil to a very big gathering of trade unionists. And that speech is now a book. It's on the internet. It's called Oil and the Global Capitalist Crisis. One of my most popular works. I give credit in that work to Bill Doris, who was really one of the people who taught me the most about economics and was really kind of my mentor and taught me a great deal about a lot of different things. Unfortunately, we don't get along anymore. But regardless, that reality, that economic reality where German capitalism has always been kicked around and is basically a second-class member of Western imperialism, that reality is still happening. And that contradiction has not gone away. And I worry about how that could play out in the coming years. I really, really do, because it's something we should all be concerned about. Because the Germans, they're a very powerful country. They have a very big economy. They have a lot of wealthy bankers and their financial districts and all of that. And Germany is basically having its arm twisted and being basically forced to do a lot of things that are not in its economic interest. Not in the economic interest even of the German ruling class. The German working class and the German ruling class are both having their arms twisted to do a lot of things that are not in their interest. And that needs to be acknowledged. And that could lead to some very, very scary economic developments. I'm just telling you. And not economic, but geopolitical developments, right? So that's all I got to say, folks. But on a happier note, stay optimistic. Try to have an optimistic view of the world. There's a lot of things to be sad about. There's a lot of things to be pessimistic about. But try to keep your head up. Try to think about how to do things right. Be like the Bernie Sanders kids that just want to help their country, want to help their fellow human beings, want to make things better. There's a lot of hope in the world. There's a lot of reason to keep your head up. The world is full of injustice, but it's also full of people like you and me that just want to make things better, that want to, really find out what the truth is and wrangle with reality and struggle and get to the truth. Those of us who never bought this Russiagate narrative, despite everything, we just wanted to know the facts, and now Bob Mueller's report confirms, basically there are no more indictments. The whole thing is a fraud. We're all in this together. We're a community here. You, me, all of us, all of you in the comments section, all you people that are saying lovely things, my fans, all of you that are saying negative things, all you haters, all you people that are just silent and aren't saying anything. We're all part of a community here. We all love each other. We all care about each other. We're in this together. We're brothers. We're comrades. We're all part of a little revolution that's taking place here on these YouTube lives. So thank you for being part of this. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. Be sure to have all your friends subscribe to the channel. I'm working on a new book, folks. I told you that last time. I got a new book in the works. I'm not telling you what it's about yet, but keep your eyes out and, try to make it through the last week of March here. April is approaching soon, and after April, we've got May, right? May 1st, May Day, International Workers' Day, and then, we're on our way into the summer. So, a lot happening in the world. I love you all. Stay strong. Fight on. Face a world full of injustice. Keep your head up. Be optimistic. I love you all. Stay strong and struggle. Best wishes. I'm out.